There is a reason old farms almost always had animals walking through the garden space. Not inside the beds during the growing season, of course, but somewhere close by, scratching, pecking, grazing, turning the soil in ways that required almost no human effort. Today, many gardeners try to rebuild soil using bags of fertilizer, compost bins, or constant amendments. And while those things can help, they also require time, effort, and sometimes money. You gather scraps, you turn piles, you measure nutrients, you buy inputs. It becomes another task on a long list of things the garden needs. But for most of agricultural history, soil fertility didn't come from bags or bottles. It came from animals. Animals eat plants. They digest those plants, and then they return those nutrients to the soil in a form that microbes and roots can quickly use. In other words, animals turn grass, weeds, kitchen scraps, and leftover plant material into one of the most powerful soil builders nature has ever designed. This is one of the hidden systems that made traditional farms so resilient. The garden produced vegetables, the animals consumed scraps and weeds, and the animals returned fertility right back to the land. A simple loop. Plants feed animals, animals feed soil, soil feeds plants again. But here's the problem with modern gardening advice. Many people separate these systems. They grow plants in one area and keep animals somewhere completely different, sometimes far away from the garden. As a result, they miss the powerful relationship between the two. Because when animals are integrated correctly, they can perform several jobs at the same time. They can control pests, they can clear weeds, they can process plant waste. And most importantly, they can build soil fertility without the gardener lifting a shovel. Some animals are particularly good at this job. They scratch through organic matter, breaking it down into smaller pieces. They mix manure into the soil surface, they stimulate microbial life, and over time, this activity begins to change the structure of the soil itself. Hard soil becomes softer, dry soil begins to hold moisture longer, and lifeless dirt slowly becomes living soil again. But not all animals are equal when it comes to helping the garden. Some are too large and can damage beds if unmanaged. Others don't interact with the soil in helpful ways. The real secret is choosing animals that naturally do the work gardeners struggle to do themselves. The kind of animals that are constantly moving, constantly scratching, constantly turning organic matter into fertility. And when you choose the right animal, something interesting happens. Your garden begins to improve even during seasons when you're not actively working it. The animals continue processing scraps. They continue spreading nutrients. They continue breaking down organic matter. In other words, fertility production becomes automatic. That's one of the core ideas behind low-input living. Instead of trying to do everything yourself, you design systems that continue working even when you step away. Animals can be one of the most powerful parts of that system. But the key is understanding which animals actually improve the soil, and which ones simply consume resources without giving much back. Because one particular backyard animal stands out as one of the most efficient soil builders a small homestead can have. It eats scraps, it hunts pests, it breaks down organic waste, and it leaves behind rich fertilizer almost every single day. One of the biggest mistakes gardeners make when trying to improve soil is assuming that more inputs automatically mean healthier ground. More compost, more fertilizer, more amendments, more digging. The logic seems reasonable at first. If plants need nutrients, then adding more nutrients should solve the problem. But soil is not just a container for nutrients. Soil is a living system. Beneath the surface of every healthy garden is an enormous community of organisms working constantly. Bacteria break down organic matter. Fungi create underground networks that move nutrients and water between plants. Earthworms tunnel through the soil, creating air pockets that roots depend on. All of these organisms together create what farmers often call living soil. The problem is that many common gardening habits accidentally disturb this living system. Constant digging breaks fungal networks. Bare soil dries out microbial life. Synthetic fertilizers can push plants to grow quickly but do very little to build long-term soil structure. Over time, soil can become something strange. It might grow plants for a while, but it loses its ability to improve itself naturally. It becomes dependent on more and more external inputs. This is where animals enter the picture. Certain animals interact with the soil in ways that mimic natural ecosystems. Instead of turning soil with machines or tools, they disturb the surface lightly and constantly. They mix organic material into the top layer where microbes can easily access it. And every day, they deposit manure that contains nutrients, beneficial bacteria, and organic matter. But there's an important detail that makes this system work. The animals must be moving. In nature, animals rarely stay in one place for long periods. Herds move across landscapes. Birds forage across large areas. This movement spreads nutrients evenly and prevents the land from becoming overloaded in one spot. When animals stay in the same place too long, the opposite happens. The soil becomes compacted, nutrients build up unevenly, and plants struggle. So, the real power of backyard livestock isn't just the manure they produce. It's the combination of three things happening together: movement, manure, and constant interaction with organic material. When these three things combine, soil begins to change much faster than it would with compost alone. Leaves disappear faster, scraps break down quicker, microbial activity increases, and the surface layer of soil begins to look darker, softer, and richer. But there's another advantage many gardeners overlook: pest control. Insects, larvae, and other garden pests often spend part of their life cycle in the soil. Some hide under leaves. Others burrow just beneath the surface, waiting for the right conditions to emerge and feed on plants. Certain animals are excellent hunters of these pests. They scratch through mulch layers, searching for insects. They dig through loose soil looking for larvae. They patrol areas where bugs like to hide. And they do this work every day. This means the same animal that fertilizes your soil may also be quietly reducing pest populations long before those pests ever reach your vegetables. It's a small example of how nature tends to combine jobs. One creature performs several roles at once. For a gardener trying to reduce labor, that kind of system is incredibly valuable. Instead of managing pests, managing compost, managing fertility, and managing waste separately, the right animal can handle several of those tasks at the same time. But again, the key question becomes, which animal actually does this work well? Some animals graze but don't interact with soil. Others produce manure but don't help with pest control. And some animals can damage gardens if they aren't carefully managed. However, there is one backyard animal that combines all of these behaviors naturally. It scratches the ground constantly. It devours insects. It processes scraps quickly. And it produces fertilizer almost every day. The backyard animal that quietly improves garden soil more than almost any other is the chicken. That might sound obvious at first. Chickens are one of the most common animals found on small homesteads. But what many people don't realize is just how powerful chickens can be when they are used as part of the garden system rather than kept completely separate from it. Chickens are natural soil workers. All day long they scratch the ground with their feet, digging through leaves, mulch, grass clippings, and loose soil. They aren't trying to cultivate a garden bed, of course. They are simply searching for insects, worms, seeds, and anything edible they can find. But that constant scratching performs an important function. It breaks apart organic material and mixes it into the top layer of soil, where microbes can quickly begin breaking it down. If you have ever seen a pile of leaves after chickens have been working through it for a few days, you'll notice something interesting. What was once a thick pile of dry leaves becomes a loose, partially decomposed layer mixed with soil and manure. That mixture is almost exactly what gardeners try to create when building compost. Except the chickens are doing the mixing automatically. At the same time, chickens are constantly producing manure. And chicken manure is particularly rich compared to many other animals. It contains nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and a wide range of trace nutrients that plants need to grow. But manure alone isn't the real magic. It's the way chickens combine manure with organic material. When chickens scratch through leaves, straw, weeds, or garden scraps, they mix their manure directly into that material. Microbes quickly begin breaking everything down together, creating a nutrient-rich layer that slowly feeds the soil. Over time, this process can transform poor soil surprisingly quickly. Gardeners who use chickens this way often notice that areas where chickens have worked for several weeks become darker and easier to dig. The soil structure improves. Water begins to soak in rather than running off, and plants grow more vigorously the following season. But chickens contribute another benefit that many gardeners appreciate even more. They are relentless insect hunters. Chickens spend a huge portion of their day searching for bugs. Beetles, grasshoppers, larvae, caterpillars, grubs. If it moves and fits in their beak, they'll usually try to eat it. This means chickens naturally reduce pest populations before those pests have a chance to explode into a garden problem. Instead of waiting until plants are damaged and then trying to control pests, chickens work quietly in the background, reducing those populations all the time. For gardeners trying to move toward a lower input system, this is incredibly valuable. But there is one important detail that determines whether chickens help the garden or destroy it. Timing. If chickens are allowed to roam freely through growing vegetable beds, they will almost certainly damage young plants. Their scratching can uproot seedlings, scatter mulch, and disturb carefully planted rows. That's why successful gardeners usually allow chickens into garden areas at specific times of the year rather than all the time. For example, chickens can be extremely useful in the fall after crops have been harvested. At that point, beds often contain leftover plant material, insects preparing to overwinter, and weeds beginning to take hold. Chickens will happily scratch through all of it. They eat leftover vegetables, hunt insects hiding in the soil, break down plant debris, and fertilize the beds at the same time. By the time spring arrives, the garden soil has already been partially prepared without much human effort. But chickens can do even more than that when they're used intentionally. Once gardeners realize how helpful chickens can be for building soil, the next step is learning how to guide their work instead of letting it happen randomly. Because while chickens are incredibly productive animals, they work best when their energy is directed towards specific areas of the garden at the right time. If chickens stay in one place for too long, they can eventually overwork the soil. Too much scratching and too much manure in a small area can compact the ground or create nutrient imbalances. But when chickens are moved periodically, something remarkable happens. Their activity spreads across the land in a balanced way, improving one section at a time. This approach is often called rotation. Instead of allowing chickens to roam everywhere continuously, gardeners move them through different sections of the property over time. Each section receives a short burst of activity, scratching, fertilizing, pest hunting, and then the chickens move on, giving the soil time to recover and absorb the benefits. Even a small backyard can use this idea. Some gardeners create temporary fencing that divides the yard into several zones. Chickens spend a week or two in one zone before being moved to the next. By the time they return to the first zone again, plants have regrown, and the soil has had time to settle. Others use portable chicken coops, sometimes called chicken tractors. These lightweight structures allow the entire coop to be moved across the yard or garden beds every few days. Chickens remain protected inside the structure, but they are constantly working fresh ground. Each new spot they visit receives manure, scratching, and pest control. Over time, this movement spreads fertility evenly across the garden. One particularly useful time to rotate chickens through garden beds is after the main growing season ends. When crops are finished, beds often contain old stems, roots, fallen vegetables, and weeds that would otherwise need to be cleared by hand. Chickens are very happy to handle this job. They scratch through the remains of plants, eat leftover seeds, hunt insects hiding in the debris, and break down organic material into smaller pieces that microbes can digest. At the same time, they add manure that begins feeding the soil for the next growing season. For many gardeners, this process replaces hours of cleanup work. Instead of pulling every plant and hauling everything away, they simply allow chickens to process the garden naturally. Another benefit of rotating chickens is weed control. Many weeds produce seeds that fall to the soil surface and wait for the right conditions to sprout. Chickens actively search for these seeds as they scratch through the ground. When they consume the seeds, those weeds never get the chance to grow. This doesn't eliminate weeds completely, but it can significantly reduce the number that appear the following year. Little by little, chickens help shift the balance of the garden ecosystem. Fewer pests survive the winter. Fewer weed seeds remain in the soil. More nutrients become available to plants, and all of this happens through the natural behavior of the animals. That's one of the key principles behind low-input systems. Instead of forcing the garden to behave a certain way, you allow natural processes to do the work for you. But there's still an important question many people ask when they first consider using animals this way. What if you don't want chickens roaming through your entire garden? What if you have a small space, or you simply want more control over where their activity happens? One of the biggest concerns people have when they first hear about using chickens to improve garden soil is control. Chickens are enthusiastic workers, but they are not particularly careful. If they wander through delicate garden beds during the growing season, they can easily scratch up seedlings, scatter mulch, and disturb carefully planted rows. But the good news is that chickens don't need constant access to the garden to make a huge difference. In fact, when their activity is guided at the right times, they can improve soil without ever damaging your crops. One of the simplest systems gardeners use is something often called a chicken compost system. Instead of maintaining a traditional compost pile that requires turning and monitoring temperatures, you simply create a compost area that chickens can access. Kitchen scraps, weeds, fallen leaves, plant trimmings, and garden waste are added to the pile over time. Chickens are naturally drawn to it. They jump into the pile searching for seeds, insects, and edible scraps. As they dig through the material, they constantly turn it over. Larger pieces get broken apart, dry leaves mix with green material, and manure is added throughout the pile. In other words, the chickens do the mixing for you. What would normally take months of careful compost management begins breaking down naturally through the daily activity of the birds. Over time, that pile transforms into rich organic material that can be spread across garden beds. Another simple method is seasonal access. Many gardeners allow chickens into their garden beds during late fall and winter, after the main crops have been harvested. At that time, the beds often contain leftover stems, plant roots, dropped vegetables, and insects preparing to overwinter in the soil. For chickens, this is a feast. They scratch through the bed searching for larvae and insects hidden beneath the surface. They eat leftover seeds that might otherwise turn into weeds next year. And as they move across the garden, they deposit manure that begins feeding soil microbes long before spring arrives. Then when planting season comes back around, the chickens are moved out again and the beds are ready for new crops. This seasonal partnership allows chickens to do some of the hardest garden cleanup work without interfering with the growing season. Even in very small spaces, this relationship between animals and soil can make a huge difference. Chickens recycle scraps, reduce pest populations, mix organic material into the soil, and constantly add fertility back into the system. And that's really the bigger lesson behind systems like this. Healthy gardens rarely exist in isolation. The most productive landscapes are ecosystems where different parts support each other. Plants feed animals, animals feed soil, and the soil feeds plants again. When those connections are working together, the amount of effort required from the gardener starts to drop. The garden becomes less about constant work and more about guiding natural processes. And that idea sits at the heart of low-input living. Instead of trying to control every part of the system, you design systems where nature does most of the work for you. If you enjoyed this video and want to explore more simple ways to grow food with less effort, make sure to subscribe to Low Input Living. There's a lot more to discover about building resilient gardens, productive homesteads, and systems that keep working even when you step away.